Hey, everybody, and welcome to our panel discussion. Can you believe it's December? It's December. Huh, who knew? But today we're going to talk about what to do when things go sideways. This is an especially important discussion for right now because if history holds, the bad guys come after a lot of folks around the holidays. Either they're already in the network and then they wait for folks to go out on their holiday break and then launch an attack, or they launch an attack knowing that the folks who are there on Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, New Year's Day are more susceptible to falling for something. There's a rural hospital that I talked to just recently, where last year, sure enough, it was Christmas Eve at 11 o'clock that they got a ransomware note on a computer. So talking. So this discussion, during the holidays is very well timed, and we appreciate you being here for this discussion. Things to know before we get started here. Number one, there's a chat on the right. If you haven't been to our events before, we like to keep them lively. Feel free to ask questions as we go. If you put something in the chat, I'll ask the question of the panelists, or answer you in the chat, or the panelists will answer you in the chat. But feel free to go in and tell us where you're joining from in the chat. It's awesome to have you all here. Remember, if we were all in a room together, it'd be rude to whisper in the back. It's not rude here. You can just use the chat. All right. You can also mute the chat if you want. If it's going ding, 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 and you want to mute it, there's a little bell on the top. You hit that and it'll mute. Also, you will get a recording of this. Anyone who registered will get a recording. The system will send it to you. It is a system. It is a webinar system. If you don't get that automatic email, feel free to email us. Email me, Jake at criticalinsight.com, and I'll make sure that you get a link, because we'll put this up on a YouTube channel. For those of you who don't know us, who are we? So Critical Insight provides cybersecurity as a service. We help organizations prepare for an attack. We help organizations detect an attack, and we help organizations respond rapidly. So that's who we are as an organization. But enough about that. The panelists today. So we have Mike and Fred, who are both the company founders. Mike Hamilton is the former CISO of the City of Seattle, company founder, and our CISO, Fred Langston, Chief Product Officer, and has worked in healthcare cybersecurity for more than 3 decades. John-Luc Peck is our head of incident response. And in the background, hopefully not during this presentation, is actually in the middle of 3 or 4 IR cases that his team is working on. My name is Jake Milstein. I'm the least interesting part of the crew, but I'm the one who gets to start all the webinars. I host our events and do marketing and sales and all sorts of other stuff like that. So let's get started here. Mike, go for it.
Jake, so here's a few news headlines that you're probably familiar with, right? So what is an incident? Getting a piece of malware on a computer, that's not really an incident. That's an IT problem that you clean up. When it escalates and it turns into something that can actually cause financial loss to your business or disruption to your government services or something like that, that's an incident. All right. So let's all remember that we're trying to avoid financial loss, and not really scary Russian cyber buffer overflow, right? That's not where we're grounding ourselves. So let's make sure that we're aware of the business terminology here. There's 3 things we're really trying to avoid. Number 1, unauthorized disclosure of protected records. Why? Because it costs about $200 a piece to clean up the record mess. There's a long tail to stuff like that. And frankly, with some of the privacy statutes coming out of California, some other states, those get followed by class action suits pretty routinely now. So unauthorized disclosure of records costs a bunch of money. We're trying to avoid that. Theft and extortion. Theft through business email compromise, which is worth about $90,000 on average every time it happens. And extortion through things like ransomware, denial of service attacks, things like that, where they're trying to flatten your network and then extort you for money. The average there is a little over $250,000. All right. That's a lot of money to lose. That's what we're trying to avoid. And then the third one is just disruption. So these things travel together, right? Ransomware is disruption of your network for the purpose of extortion. Those are the things that we are trying to avoid. And when disrupts, especially if you're in manufacturing, know on a per minute basis how much money you're going to lose if you cannot operate. So again, these are the business outcomes that we're trying to avoid here. Now there is a transition point from an IT issue to a security incident. All right, detection of an unauthorized presence on the network. Yep, got to put out that fire before the house burns down. Yep. um, account compromise that I believe was one of the things we're going to go over today. Yep, that's, you got to get in front of that. Somebody in your email system is going to start this business email compromise chain of events that's going to result in loss. Uh, Reports of computers slowing down and being sluggish. Cryptocurrency mining might be going on, right? So these start out as kind of IT things, and then they transition to a real incident. And here we're talking about massive amounts of loss, right? Maersk lost $300 million, right? When the hospitals go down and they are specifically targeted, potential impact is loss of life. And we know what happened when we had the Colonial Pipeline incident, and 45% of the fuel supply for the East Coast got nullified. So these are big deals. Go ahead and go to that next slide, Jake, and I will point out that middle number there. If the FBI calls and says your customer records are for sale online, okay, that's an incident, and you're going to have to really get in front of that. And when we're talking about these incidents that are going to result in financial loss, you're going to have to scramble a management team that does communication, that has a finance component to it, that has a legal component to it, because all these things are going to need to be brought to bear. And the last thing I'll say is that first number there, 287 days until average, until someone detects that an asset in their network is compromised, that's actually gone up. So we're getting worse at this. We're not getting better at this. So I'll just introduce these concepts, and hopefully everybody keeps that in mind. We're trying to avoid business outcomes that are bad.
And by the way, that 287 days is why we talk about holidays, right? If they're in your system, they take advantage of the holidays to you know to launch the attack. Okay, so what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about 3 ways things could go sideways, 3 ways things could go wrong. We're going to talk about an account takeover. We're going to talk about a high severity vulnerability announced. We're going to talk about detection of lateral movement. Now, there is no way in an hour we could cover all of the different ways that things could go wrong. You all have been in your chairs for a while. You know all the ways things could go wrong, but we're going to talk about these 3 because there are ways that you handle these that you can apply to anything. Fred.
Yeah, there we go. So the things that we continually stress to our clients, you have to be prepared. If you are not prepared, you stand little chance of effectively responding to an incident. In fact, you can probably expect a worst case outcome if you're not prepared. So what are these things you need to do? Well, you need to have a plan, and the plan is a number of documents and a number of activities. You need an incident management policy. What does the policy do? Policy is where you define this is what an incident is, right? Because it's not your plan. You can't define an incident in your plan because you got to call an incident to activate the plan. So where do you define that? You define that in your policy. Defining this is a key step. It is not easy to effectively define when you should break everybody out of what they're doing, drop what you're doing, let's convene, let's have an incident response action taken. So having that policy and defining what an incident is, key step. Incident response plan defines the roles, it defines the responsibilities, it defines what you do, and you couple that with a set of playbooks, meaning I have a playbook for business email compromise. Here's the step-by-step actions I take whenever we have business email compromise. Ransomware. I have the step-by-step. I may even have the actual backup software. Click this button, press this button next, do this within the playbook to help us rapidly bring things back. I want to have the instructions like a cookbook in front of me so I can rapidly move through those activities. You need a tabletop exercise. I didn't put that on here stupidly. You need a tabletop exercise. We use this analogy all the time that Not having a tabletop is like having to read the instructions to the fire extinguisher while the house is burning. Okay, you're going to watch it burn to the ground. You don't want to be learning what to do in the middle of an emergency. That's craziness, right? Please go out and run a tabletop exercise and invite all the relevant people. If I'm at a hospital, we've had hospitals, we go out and do tabletops, and I see the chief medical officer is not in the room. That's a huge problem. The chief medical officer is going to be the one that says, I need to start diverting patients or they're going to die. And if that person isn't first and foremost and informed about the state of the network and the ability to provide patient care, you got a huge problem and people could actually die. Right. So make sure everybody that needs to make critical decisions, it's not IT, it's not just legal, it's not just comms. They're the operational folks in your organization that need to make some critical decisions. And whenever you're recovering from one of these, most of the time, you're doing things that are in your disaster recovery business continuity plan. We all know about recovering from backups, and that's usually well described in your DRBC plan. Well, these should be sitting next to each other because the processes for recovery are very similar, if not identical, especially in ransomware. You're probably executing exactly the steps your DR plan has to recover than you would from ransomware because it's similar to having everything blows up and you've lost everything. Right? Make sure that there's a way for people to say, I see something funny going on. I'm worried. Maybe I realized I clicked on an email I shouldn't have. You need to make sure people know how to let the incident response team or the IT team or the people in charge that something funny may be going on, and you need to cover it extensively in security awareness training. The number one way to alert that something bad is happening when a user raises their hand and says something funny's going on here. So they are your human MDR, right? They're the ones that are going to report it. You need to have them report rapidly. Make sure what your insurance policy says. What are the limitations? What are the requirements? How do I prove I have a claim? What happens if, in fact, we are going to pay the ransom? Make the decision ahead of time. Nobody should be making the decision, do we pay a ransom during an incident? That should have happened in the tabletop exercise or in a policy decision 6 months before that. There should be no question. When you get to that part of a decision-making process, you should know we're going to either pay or we're definitely not. That should be already be made. And you should probably have access to cryptocurrency so you can actually pay that. So you may want to set up the ability to create cryptocurrency so you can actually pay a ransom. These things are all critical. Time is of the essence. And the ability to go out and get additional resources. I mean, this is a shameless plug. We have a team that Jean-Luc runs. If you call us, for example, when Hafnium came out, we got 60 calls in one day. We do not have capacity to handle 60 calls in one day. So if you have not created a relationship, potentially put us on a retainer, you're going to get the same thing because everybody got those same 60 calls in one day, and no one on the planet had capacity during an emergency. So this is all preparation. If you don't have these things in place, expect disaster. I hate to put it that way. Next slide, Jake. And the things, again, that we want to make sure is the executives understand all the components they need to handle. When we say communications, there is communicate to the affected internal parties, communicate to the rest of the company who wasn't affected, potentially communicate to our clients, potentially communicate to our vendors, potentially communicate to the government and attorneys general if we've had a breach, communicate to CISA and the FBI. That's 7, and there's more, right? So if you haven't already planned out what those 7 communications are going to be, again, do you want to do this during the middle of an incident? Do it ahead of time, right? Make sure your attorneys are already involved, understand what their position will be along these things. Make sure what kind of, can we get the money? If we're going to pay the ransom, who needs to sign off on it? Because if that person is not around, you're in deep trouble. I mentioned, do we pay the ransom? Key part of this. What does cyber insurance do? Are they going to provide a breach response team? Do I still want to have my own team to keep their breach response team honest? Which I hate to say is actually something we see quite often. So understand all the components. What's the deductible? How do I spend up to that deductible? So then I can get the money, part of my policy, right? What do I have to have in place to ensure that they're going to pay? Because if I realize I said I had multi-factor authentication, we don't have multi-factor, they're not going to pay, right? So know what's in that policy, know what you agreed to, and make sure the team is defined and everybody has seen the plan. Don't pull them together and go, hey, here's a plan. Cool. Let's execute. They need to know this plan.
Let's all read it.
Let's all read it. Let's have it in our back pocket, right?
Yeah, I
All
mean,
right.
and speaking of things to read, I've gotten deeply involved in the insurance world. If you have a broker that doesn't know cyber and just says, "Oh yeah, these things are in your policy," make sure it's in your policy. If I've seen that happen this year where somebody got told by a broker, "Oh yeah, this is in your wasn't in the policy," and of course the underwriter is not. Oh, the broker said it. That doesn't work. All right. So now we're going to go into the three situations, and John Luke, who sometimes you hear us call JLP, but John Luke is going to go through the three. So John Luke, the first one, account takeover.
Yeah. So this is becoming a more and more common circumstance and situation which we see on the incident response team because we're seeing such a variety of accounts in use for normal business activity. So 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we talk about a network account. That network account would probably be a local network account on your business environment. It's what you'd use to check email from your email servers hosted by your company. You would VPN back to your company network with that username and password. It's what you'd use for everything. Well, these days we have the on-premise network, but we also have Office 365, and we also have Dropbox, and we also have Salesforce, and we also have HRIS systems. And we have all these third-party business apps which are being used every day by employees for conducting business. Some organizations have got those tied back in by technologies like single sign-on so that they're working with a centralized directory infrastructure. Others don't. And everybody's managing these accounts one by one. A lot of times we discover that when an employee leaves an organization, for example, IT doesn't even know all of the accounts that the employee held. And so they don't know that they need to go and turn off the Salesforce account and the Dropbox account and the Google Analytics account and the Twitter account and the Facebook account, and on it goes. And so these accounts get left active for quite a long time, even once the employee has left the role quite frequently. But that's not a requirement for the attackers to go after it. If the attackers are able to get your password, guess your password, or use some other method to get your credentials and put it to work, it's quite possible that they could log in directly to Office 365 or to a third party application or to your VPN or your on premise infrastructure. And maybe a monitoring system like your firewall is going to see it, maybe not. That's where the account takeover becomes an incident. So, account takeovers can be any network account, any third party app or service account used by your employees for their day to day business purposes, which then become taken over and used by the attackers for their own purposes. This first line here that we're talking about with business email compromise, this is the common scenario where we see an email account gets taken over, and then they're going to pretend to be the employee or the owner of that mailbox. And they're going to be sending around bad links and bad invoices and stuff with potentially incorrect routing information. What they're trying to do there is either spread their presence around, get you to click a link, which will then steal your credentials or implant malware on your computer as well. And they're also trying to extract funds. So we're seeing a high prevalence of business email compromise, which is also becoming wire fraud and financial fraud and essentially theft of funds. But it also leads to access to business data, things like SharePoint and Teams. If you've got your entire company repository of information up on SharePoint and all your employees are allowed to get to it, all it takes is one compromised account for all of that data to potentially be in the hands of the attackers. That doesn't even start with talking about things that you've got hosted up in email, for example, just in an email box. So the potential impact of a compromised account here is significantly increased from where it used to be. What it used to involve was a limited number of systems, usually on premise. Now we've got a wide variety of systems, third party, on premise, cloud hosted, and oftentimes they're all interlinked. And so one single instance, one account compromise can spread out to become a very sizable incident, especially if that account also either leads to or was something like an infrastructure service account, which may have root or domain admin rights on your network. And then there's domain administrator rights. So there's all these different levels where an account takeover can be a very serious, very massive problem for IT in a very short amount of time, or it can be kind of a small, noisy thing happening off in the background that takes a while for people to notice. But it's typically when an organization sees suspicious activity from a user account, either emails going out or files and links which shouldn't be, or significant volumes of downloads and data being transferred. Those are the kinds of activities which typically trip off an account takeover alert such as this. So, what happens when you have an account takeover like this? So, first up, you got to lock the attackers out. Now, we talk about changing credentials here. And in the old days, in the before time, when it was all on premise and we were talking about Active Directory as the main network directory source, just changing the password would work. That would be enough. But these days, especially with Office 365, there's an extra step we have to take. Just changing the password won't boot anybody logged in out of the environment or out of Office 365. You have to go so far as to revoke all the active sessions as well. This is a very critical part of Office 365 incident response, which we still see a lot of organizations aren't aware of. So there's multiple steps which have to be taken here with O365 just to get the attackers out. Then you have to prevent them from coming back in. That's where we start the investigation to, like it's on the slide here, we're looking for backdoors. Things like service accounts, credentials, what kind of protocols were they using to access the account? One of the things that we've seen on the incident response side is that it's not just people going to portal.office.com and trying to log in. They're also pretending to be things like an email client. So they're connecting up using what Microsoft calls legacy protocols, which is essentially protocols like SMTP for transferring mail, but that doesn't know how to speak MFA. Now, Microsoft by default is turning those off on new Office 365 instances. So if you're a new business or you've recently shifted over to Office 365, there's a good chance those legacy protocols are turned off. But if you've been an Office 365 customer for several years, if you've got a complex environment that you've done a lot of customizations on, it's distinctly possible those legacy protocols are still turned on, and the attackers are going to be looking for that. And so there's ways and indicators that we can use to see what are the attackers trying to get into, how are they trying to get in, and what do we need to do in order to close those back doors. As we're doing this kind of investigative work, logs, logs, logs. Logs are what we look to for all of the indicators, for all of the data that we can use very quickly. There are other types of analysis we can run, like a disk examination if you've got a compromised laptop or a compromised server, but that takes a bunch of time. If you've got logs either through Office 365 or from your servers or from your firewall and your network, that allows us very quickly to start targeting the exact events that we're looking for, the times that we're looking for, and then we can start broadening the scope to see what else we need to include, what other systems may have been affected, what other accounts may have been compromised. But the logs are what we start with whenever possible. Now, the last line item here is really important. Analysis as to whether customer communication is warranted. So if you have a compromised user account, you don't necessarily want to be putting your hand up and saying, hey, by the way, our email accounts got hacked. Isn't that great, everybody? Aren't we happy that we've told you now that your email accounts have been hacked? That doesn't do a lot of people a lot of good very quickly. However, what you have to be concerned about is what data is at risk. If you've got an email box which gets compromised, and that email box has got a bunch of your clients' billable information in it, things like bank account information, PII, like names, addresses, email addresses, phone numbers, it's important to make sure that you notify people who have been potentially impacted by your compromised account. If their data is at risk because of an incident in your systems, it's important to notify them ahead of time rather than letting them discover that their information is now for sale on the dark web, or that they're about to start receiving messages saying, hey, by the way, here's our invoice, please send all the money to me. And by the way, here's our new bank account information. It just happens to be the Bank of Ukraine. So it's important to talk about how do we want to communicate, what do we want to say, and then making sure that you run any and all communications past your legal team to make sure that things are going out in a approved manner and you're not accidentally or inadvertently putting the company at too much risk or exposure because you're saying too much too soon potentially. So there's a lot of factors which go into this here. Account takeovers, as simple as they can be, oftentimes are the precursor to a much larger incident, and they can get very complex just in and of themselves.
And hey, JLP, so on this and whether the customer communication is warranted, if you have an account takeover, how do you know how do you know what the bad guy was able to see in the account? Were they able to see every, like, if person, you know let's say there's a person, and let's call him Bob, right? Bob, has his account taken over. Is anything that Bob had access to in the org, do you just then assume that the bad guy could see and take advantage of all of that?
That's like the fallback position. That's the position that an organization has to take if they can't prove conclusively, here's what we know was accessed. And that's where logs come back into play. So we'll go back to logs, logs, logs all the time. It's all about what logs you've got available, how far back do they go, and can we use them during incidents and investigations. Office 365, for example, will log who clicked what where. Did you go to this file on SharePoint? Did you open this email? Did you download this? Did you preview that? But it only stores those logs for a limited amount of time. And so if
Hmm.
you have an event which goes on for 35 days, 95 days or so, and your log, because of your service level, whether you're E3, G5, whatever the case may be, if your service level only stores 30 days worth of logs, we only have 30 days worth of data to work with. If your service level only stores 90 days worth of logs, we only have 90 days to work with.
Sure.
And so if you're a large organization and you have regulated data, and those logs aren't enough for us to say we see when the attacker got in and now we see where they've been, then we have to assume breach and we have to assume that the data that they had access to is compromised. And that can be quite costly. Going back to that record figure that Mike threw out earlier, which I think you said was 200, 250 per record.
Yeah, it's between 200 and 300, depending on exact, health sector's a little more.
Yeah, exactly. So that's where it can get to be quite costly. But again, this is where logs can absolutely save an organization's bacon during an incident.
Yeah, and
Got to point out,
and I was going to quote John in the chat. If you haven't been reading your logs, you will suddenly become very familiar with them.
yeah.
Indeed.
And I'd like to point out that out of the box, especially if you have on-premise servers, Windows is not set up to log at an appropriate level for you to do a complete forensic investigation, meaning you will probably say, I can't tell you whose records were compromised, so I'm going to have to say every single record we have was compromised. So make sure if you have out-of-the-box logging configuration, you're not going to be able to define who's done it. You got to kick it up quite a bit.
100%. Fred is right on the money with that. That is especially true for domain controllers who are handling all of the authentication requests for an organization. There are times we see those logs don't go back further than an hour or two. So making sure you've got some structure or system in place which is capturing those logs and storing them for 2 weeks, a month, whatever the case may be. Again, that can absolutely be the make or break deciding factor in an incident.
How about a
Yeah.
year? I would
Yeah.
suggest you have them for a year.
If
Readily
we
available for 90 days. Should have them for up to at least a year.
Yeah, if you're in the public sector, that's
Mhm.
that's all regulated. You have to retain
Yes.
records, and everything's got a certain retention schedule associated with it. But
Yeah.
if and really, if you're going after the logs, one of the things you want to do is uncap, if you can, that retention period so that you can continue to build up log, because it may go that long.
Yep. Yep. And just a couple of things in the chat. April saying, look at your logs now so you know what normal looks like, so you can help ignore irrelevant alerts. And then Danny's quip that inflation, it used to be $100 a record. All right, let's get to situation number 2 here. This is a high severity vulnerability announced.
So this one I really like because this is the kind of thing which pops up usually out of nowhere and it hits a lot of people very quickly. Doesn't necessarily mean it's an active compromise, but it does mean there's a lot of organizations which have to scramble to respond to this. Now, I think about a year ago, I think it was during the Colonial Pipeline incident, Fred started putting this concept forward of how to treat severity or high severity vulnerabilities as an incident in order to make sure that you got the necessary attention to manage this. Previously, before things like Hafnium and Log4j, what we've been seeing is high severity vulnerability comes out. It affects every version of Windows Server or every version of Exchange Server or something out there. And then IT scrambles for a few days and goes, oh no, everything's on fire. We need to figure it out. But then it falls to the back burner. Then other stuff comes up and starts taking priority. And that's where the focus goes. And then 3 months, 6 months, a year later, we find those vulnerabilities are still out there. And so I really like this new approach of when there's something like Hafnium, treat it like an incident. Activate your incident response plan. Use an incident management team, even if they're only meeting every week, even if they're only meeting every 2 weeks, whatever the case may be. Make sure you're keeping the priority up on getting this resolved, because if you don't, what it leads to is having systems potentially public facing, which are at high risk of being compromised. Now, this is especially true if we're talking about legacy systems, stuff like Windows Server 2003. God help us, they're still floating around out there. Server 2008, Windows Server 2012. If you've got these systems that are floating around on the internet, meaning they've got public visibility on the internet, somebody can use an IP address and connect directly to them, whatever the case may be, they're at risk. And especially if they're not sitting behind an intrusion prevention system. A lot of organizations we're seeing are still putting Windows servers directly on the internet, or they're using firewall policies and opening stuff up nice and wide so that essentially the threat management features of their firewall have been neutered. This doesn't do you any good when you're not patching your systems and keeping stuff up to date. So what this can lead to is, let's take hafnium, for example. So a set of vulnerabilities was identified by researchers very quickly. Proof of concept code was put out there about how to take advantage of those vulnerabilities. That proof of concept code then gets taken by the attackers and turned into an attack toolkit. That attack toolkit is then distributed across the internet very widely. And now everybody with 5 minutes and a YouTube account is able to go and figure out, how do I take advantage of every Exchange server floating around on the internet? That leads to lots of door knocking, lots of knob twisting, lots of red lights popping up on dashboards. And then that means that we have to treat everyone as if it's an active incident, because any one of those could be. And so if you're an organization which has got potentially dozens of systems still public facing, those are your high risk assets. Those assets are now at massive risk of being compromised and taken over because these new exploits are floating around out there. Oftentimes, these exploits are floating around for weeks or even months before indicators are developed so that we know what to look for in things like intrusion prevention systems or PCAP data. And so those exploits could be leveraged by the attackers, especially if we're talking about nation state level attackers here, where they've got the ability to get in quietly using very advanced tooling. And then their goal is to hang out and watch. They're resident on your networks, again, going back to that 280 odd days dwell time that Mike was talking about there. And so with all of the impacts that we talk about of records lost, systems going offline, ransomware, compromised email, BEC, these can all stem from a system which is exposed and taken advantage of, because all it takes is one system which an attacker can get even a slight foothold on, and then they're able to start pivoting around inside the rest of your network. That's where we start looking for lateral movement. We'll get into that here in just a little bit. But what do we do when we see a severity or a high severity vulnerability like this? Number one, absolutely treat it like an incident. I'm fully on board with this methodology. Declare an incident, activate your incident response team, take a look at how far and wide this vulnerability is going to affect you and your organization. If you've got one system and it's locked away behind half a dozen firewalls on the inside of your network, you can probably close down the incident response team just as long as you make sure you patch it up sometime later. If it's one of a dozen systems sitting on the internet with public IP addressing, that's something you're going to want to address very quickly. And if you can't pull those systems back while patches are being developed, while the workarounds and the detection methods are being developed, then at least the IR team is going to continue to watch them. And then, to April's point, you can start watching the logs, you can start watching for normal baseline activity. And that way, you know, hey, I see strange Chinese IP addresses logging into this webmail server, which shouldn't be supporting anybody outside of the Texas area. What's going on here? That's the kind of indicators that you use to trigger a further investigation. So to Mike's point, or I'm sorry, to Fred's point earlier about when these vulnerabilities happen for lots of organizations, incident response teams get slammed. Everyone gets a ton of calls, and they're all trying to figure out how to respond to either, excuse me, the customer who is most on fire or whoever called in first, depending on how they're going to prioritize things. So this is where it's really important to make sure that you have a pre-existing relationship with an incident response services provider. If you've got an incident response retainer, you know you can pick up the phone and call them and say, hey, this Hafnium 2.0 thing or this brand new vulnerability, we think we're seeing something. I need your help right now. They'll get resources available. They can either help you confirm or disprove you've got an incident in progress, or they'll confirm that you're susceptible and yes, here's what you should do to address it. Or if you do have an incident in process, they'll help you contain it. Prioritizing the patch applications and the workarounds immediately, absolutely. It's critically important to get the patches deployed out as soon as they're available. Sometimes this can come back and bite us. We saw with Hafnium that it took Microsoft 3 or 4 tries to get the patches quite right. So it's not a single fix. It's not a one-shot solution, unfortunately. And then this last point, if there is no workaround, if possible, disable the service. But if not, because it's a business critical function or something, monitor, monitor, monitor. Going right back to all the logging data. If you're not monitoring it, you're not logging it, you don't know what's going on.
A quick follow up to this because these are good points. And just to be clear, so John Luke was talking about the fact that nation states in particular are so tooled up that when a public facing vulnerability is announced, the scanning for that will start 5 minutes later. All right. They're serious about this. They have teams on this. They will have reverse engineering teams to reverse engineer, especially if a patch comes out. It's easy to reverse engineer an exploit that will break what the patch is supposed to fix. Okay. So you may think, hey, I'm not in the sights of nation states, right? Is that really a thing for me? Well, let me tell you, North Korea steals money. They steal money from banks, they steal cryptocurrency exchange money, and they use it to fund weapons of mass destruction. This has all been validated. Um, the FBI just put out a warning about the Russian sandworm, what they call the sandworm group, right? It's an APT, Advanced Persistent Threat Group. That's a government sponsored group. And they're saying, watch out, the sandworm group is using this kind of ransomware. So here's a state actor doing this for money. And then the third one is China was just busted for $20 million in PPP loan fraud and other things, right? So nation states are coming after money, all right? Going back to the very first thing I said, right? Cement this in your mind. This is about trying to avoid business outcomes. And yes, now the nation states are coming after money, and that's you.
I also like to point out, if you think patching within 30 days is okay, I will tell you every bad guy on the planet has already read our regulations that say you will patch within 30 days, and they know they have a 30-day window in which to do things. So if you are going to wait to that patch window everybody else waits, the bad guys know, and they're coming for you, and they're going to do it before that window closes.
For sure, for sure. And by the way, this sort of came up in the chat a little bit, but that so a lot of people count on their insurance company to be their incident to if you have an incident, you're going to call, right? If you have an urgent patch, you can't call your insurance company for an incident response help. That is that's not how insurance companies work. So you can't use that as a backup. Okay, let's go to situation number 3.
Wish we could, though.
Do you?
Yeah,
Do you
no joke.
really?
Get
Do
in
you
here
really?
and fix this for me. Yeah.
Situation number 3, lateral movement detected. John Luke?
So this is a nice wide category which covers just about anything which could be detected inside a network on an endpoint, but anything essentially past the point of compromise. If we're seeing lateral movement, what that means is that the attackers already have a presence somewhere. Whether they've stolen an account and they've logged in as you and they're starting to find other accounts, whether they've compromised an endpoint and they're getting ready to start spreading malware around, trying to find other systems to take over, they're in right now. And so lateral movement can appear to be anything from a network event, like this user account tried to access this file share, that's atypical, or this user account is now going through and sequentially updating all of these files with strange file extensions, and now all of those files are encrypted. That looks like ransomware activity. A lot of systems will be able to use that to proactively lock out an account, for example. But if we see something like malware which pops up on an endpoint and then pops up on another endpoint, that's indicative that there's some kind of back channel communication going, like they've got a local network connection or they're able to share files using a shared information service or something. But that we've got an incident and an event in progress where the foothold has already been acquired. And what we need to do is identify what systems are in scope and then figure out how to eradicate, how to get the attacker out of the environment and get those systems isolated or quarantined. Some of the potential impacts from a lateral movement detection alert, and again, this can be anything from IC malware to a user account doing something. It's very unlikely your threat monitoring systems are going to say, I see lateral movement. This looks like lateral movement to me. it's going to be a number of types of alerts which indicate there's something going on behind the scenes there, but it can lead to any one of these types of impacts and examples. Ransomware is the hot topic, of course. If they can get in and they're able to steal your records and they're going to drop their malware, they're going to leave ransomware waiting for you, and then they're probably going to set it off at one of the most inopportune moments that they can. Records disclosure, again, we're talking about things like your SharePoint sites being downloaded, databases being accessed, email boxes being accessed. If the attackers have access and we can't prove that we can see exactly what they accessed, we have to assume that they had access to all of it. Theft and extortion, the I have your data, pay me not to release it type of thing. Disruption and island hopping, where they're moving around inside of a network and potentially bringing down services or defacing website, for example. So these are all examples of where the attackers can go. But ultimately, if they have an account or they have an endpoint, they're going to be using that to their advantage and trying to do stuff that you don't want them to be doing on it. So, what do we do if we see something indicative of lateral movement or an attempt at lateral movement? Number one is we quarantine, quarantine, quarantine. If you have a system, an endpoint, a server, a network device, or a user account, and it's demonstrating suspicious activity like this, lock it down. Just lock it out. I would so much rather have to have a conversation about why somebody's email account was unexpectedly shut down rather than why that one incident turned into actually like 10 compromised user accounts. It's much easier to just point the fire extinguisher and blast it by isolating computers, locking out user accounts, shutting down network ports, and if necessary, unplugging servers, turning off virtual machines, shutting down systems, whatever it takes in order to both quarantine or isolate the affected systems and protect everything that is not yet identified. Identifying external source addresses and putting in block rules, this is a fantastic approach. We also like to see this with things like file hashes and file signatures with your EDR solution. So if we know that this endpoint has been talking to this public IP address and we see that that's clearly command and control data or there's file transfer activities going on, we can block that public IP address at the perimeter of the network. And that's going to stop any other systems that may get infected from being able to phone home. Now, we've seen, for example, ransomware attacks can get stopped midstream by this because if, for example, one incident that we worked, the firewall was set to only allow network traffic out over standard ports, stuff like port 80, port 443. If it wasn't going out on the standard port, it was blocked by default. The malware tried to phone out on port 8080, 8080. And so the malware was able to run, the malware was spreading across the environment, and it was already going after the file server, encrypting and locking all the files. But because it wasn't able to phone home, it wasn't able to download the encryption key. And so all it was effectively doing was renaming the files. That was a very easy one to recover from because we had the network capability of stopping that traffic in progress. So that's one way of stopping it at the network level. If you have an EDR or an antivirus solution and you're able to identify the file signature, like the file name of the malware, the file hash, or any other indicators that the file is exhibiting, you can load that up into your EDR solution or your antivirus tool. And you can say, just don't let this program run. If it's not from Microsoft, lock it out. A lot of systems, for example, have got a restricted execution mode where it will only run trusted applications. And so if you think you're dealing with malware, which might be morphing, or an attacker who's using a variety of tools, you can just say, I'm going to lock my environment down right now. So I'm only going to allow trusted applications to run for the time being. This might be somewhat restrictive for your employees if, for example, they're using a lot of custom applications or third-party stuff which may not be signed or trusted, published through code signing and trusted publishers. That could be a challenge. But again, what's the conversation we want to have here? Why did we accidentally shut down some people from being able to conduct business? Or why did we do nothing and we let the incident spread? So these are conversations and decisions that an incident response team or an incident governance team has to have in order to determine what's the best response approach here? What's the best way for us to keep this from expanding and getting worse here?
And
But this, yeah,
and,
go ahead.
and hey, John Luke, there's a question that came up in the chat, and you kind of hit on it there, and I'm going to expand on it. So Scott asks, "What's your feeling about next gen AV that looks at behaviors?" You kind of got into that a little bit with talking about Defender. I mean, there are some, Fred, that we really recommend more than others, and there are some that are really good.
Yeah. Well, the first thing I'd say is actually the behavioral analysis is probably a decade old. They've been doing UEBA, user or entity behavioral analysis. These approaches have been pretty well in use on almost all AV now for about 10 years. But what really I think makes good AV is somebody that has a wide footprint of installed endpoints. And one of the reasons Microsoft has vaulted to the top of endpoint protectors is they have more endpoints than anybody on planet Earth that they're able to get telemetry from. So they're able to see 0 days and new threats before anybody else. That's a real advantage. So I would say if you're looking to vet your endpoint protection technology, go with somebody that has a significant footprint out in the world.
All right. John Luke, did you have more on this slide?
I think we covered the important parts, other than
All right.
log. If you haven't heard us say it before, don't forget to log.
Always going to go back to that. What records do you have that are going to be helpful? Go round them up.
So John Luke, now just, we have a couple of slides here, and by the way, I know people are going to ask for the slides later. The right thing to do is email me or email Ellie, and we'll get you the slides. But John Luke, why don't you go through the next couple here? So sort of a checklist for folks.
You bet. So I know that there's a lot of folks in the audience here who have recently done an incident response development program with us, or have recently done a tabletop. A, fantastic to have you all here. We're very glad to see you. B, you might know some of this already. If so, give yourself a pat on the back here. So what do you do when you have an incident or event? Number one, use your IR plan. I can't tell you the number of tabletop exercises we've done where even if they're holding the IR plans and we say ahead of time, by the way, use your IR plans. Let's talk about these policies and plans you have available here. They still don't actively get used. Organizations are not referring to them during an incident. Now, this is kind of a tightrope walk because nobody wants to be sitting there reading through 50 or 100 pages worth of policy while you've got a house fire running around on the other side of the house here. It makes sense that people would want to jump into action. But those actions have to be measured, they have to be logical, and they have to be part of a group and coordinated response. If you've got half a dozen incident response team members who are all running off in different directions doing different things, they're going to start running into each other, they're going to start bumping heads, and they're going to have differences of opinions about how do we go about dealing with this. Organizations can quickly find themselves just having discussions and debates about, is this really that bad? Is this ransomware really all that we think it is? What do we do here? Oh, just pay the ransom. It's no big deal. These are the kinds of conversations you have to have ahead of time so that people know, what's my role? What's my responsibilities? Who's in charge here? Who is the incident commander? Who will be delegating tasks and assigning activities out? Those are the kinds of things which the incident response plan is going to set. So once you know you've got an incident, then you got to activate the plan. You got to rally the incident response team. This can be done through a number of ways, like sending out an email or making phone calls or opening up a war room and having everybody come and join you in the conference room or on the Teams bridge, for example. But you just need to get those people engaged. You need to make sure they understand we're having an incident. The incident response plan is being activated. And then we start talking about what third-party services do you want to use. So one of the things that we talk about during a tabletop exercise or when we're doing incident response plan work with an organization is how quickly do your insurance company providers need to be notified? Some organizations have a requirement, some insurance providers require that you notify them within 24 hours of a detected security event or an incident or a known breach. Others 72 hours or a week. We've even seen one which very specifically said, just let us know like within 30 days or so, and here's the PO box to mail the letter to. There literally was not a website or a phone number or a fax number. It was all by snail mail correspondence. Personally, I was left kind of scratching my head figuring out how do we like know who can be used here? What third-party resources can we activate because your policy doesn't have a phone number to call and ask questions here. So again, this is something you want to find out long in advance of an actual incident. You want to know these things anytime. You've got to be able to pick up the phone and say, I'm having an event, I need resources now. So these third parties that we talk about, sometimes they're incident response retainers. We talked about the retainer contracts and the advantages that they can have. Sometimes they're dedicated forensic specialists. Sometimes it's your managed service provider or your outsourced IT provider. All of these resources are good to have on standby through pre-staged contracts. And then when you do have an event, you give them a call, you let them know, hey, we've got something going on, may need you, we're not sure yet, or yes, we absolutely need help right now. But that makes sure that you and your team have got outside resources to look to fall back on, and to bring in help when you need to. So contacting your insurance carrier. We talked about the time limits here, but ultimately this has to be a business decision here. So one of the things that we're seeing is that some deductibles are higher than the cost of incident response services. If your deductible is $50,000, it may be a $25,000 incident response deal. So at that point, is it worth contacting your insurance? Because they're going to now note that you've had another incident. There's a good chance your rates and your premiums are going to go up. And if they do, those increases are probably not going to be small. We've got some organizations who, over the course of normal business, just because of the changes in the industry here, where previously they had $1 million worth of coverage, now they're only able to get like half that or $250,000 worth of coverage. Their costs went up. And the insurance carrier is also applying a whole bunch more restrictions to make sure that they're doing things like keeping up to date with their patches, keeping their antivirus software up, and encrypting their hard drives. So these are all good things that we always recommend and advocate for anyway. But it's different if your insurance carrier is saying, hey, you have to do these things, but also if you didn't, now you don't have any coverage. So it's important to make sure that you know these limitations and that you've got all of their requirements addressed. I think that's everything on this slide.
It is.
Other than logs. Have we talked about logs yet?
You should look at your logs.
So the next thing that we do once an incident's been activated is we need to put a scope around it. Now, when we talk about scopes, that's a very broad term, which can mean anything from a scope of work, like a proposal, to an incident scope, to, hey, I'm scoping that star out up in the sky. So with a scope, what we're talking about is what user accounts are affected. What records are in play? How many systems have been affected here? We've got one incident which we've been supporting where we found the initial point of compromise, and then they were able to find a half dozen other systems which were contacted from that system. And then from there, they were able to find another half dozen systems that each of those systems had contacted. So it very quickly went from a couple of systems up to around 50 systems or so, which had all been contacted or affected. They've got to do their due diligence in order to figure out, are those systems still safe? Can we put those back into service here? So it's not just, oh, the system got touched by the malware, we're just going to burn it all down, nor is it, oh, we don't know this system got affected, so we're just going to leave it up and running. There's a lot of processes which have to go into determining, is the environment still safe to continue operations, or were these systems compromised to a point that we need to either restore or rebuild them? So with the scoping, we're trying to figure out what's in play here. What's been affected, what's at risk, what else is still protected, what do we need to isolate and segment. But this tells us how big is the event and where do we need to start working on taking actions. And then determining the operational priorities. So every incident is different, every organization is different, and every attack has got different methodologies and a different outcome that the attackers are going for. Even if it's, I just want money or I'm trying to steal your records, they're always working it through different methods, different options, and every engagement with an attacker, if, for example, you start talking with them about paying the ransom, every conversation is going to go a little bit differently. And so, what we recommend is that an organization, when they're having an incident, they figure out, what do we want to focus on right now? Do we want to focus on figuring out who's affected, what records are in play, what records may have been accessed here? Or do we want to focus on keeping operations going? Do we want to focus on protecting what we can save in the current environment and quarantining off whatever we can't? These all come to play in a major incident. They will be components of any incident. You know, if you, for example, if you're familiar with the pick-Earl methodology of preparation and containment and eradication, for example, but any organization has to decide, what are we going to focus on right now? And if you've just had an incident or an event start, those first hours, especially the first 8, 24, 36 hours, those are the critical ones where you have the opportunity to help keep the containment zone set up. You have the ability to manage the size and scope of the event. But if we're focusing over in the wrong area, sometimes that's deliberate as part of the attack methodology. Hey, I'm going to have you focus on your website while I actually go and attack your bank accounts or something, then we can potentially miss something. And so it's important that we clarify what the priorities are, where do we want the resources focusing, and what work streams do we need to be managing here. But it's also important to note this can change. The priority on Monday can be different from the priority on Tuesday, and new information coming to the light over the course of the incident can change what we want to be focusing on. That's all part of the way that incidents go. And so we use tabletop exercises, to Fred's point earlier here, in order to help teams practice and prepare for that ahead of time. And those tabletop exercises are a great opportunity for an incident response team, the executive team, and the technical team to all work on, how do we think through this? What do we need to be thinking about? What do we need to have ready? And when the actual event happens, what are the first steps that we need to take? being practiced can absolutely make or break the difference.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, somebody just asked me, what's the best training you can do? I always answer SAT is good. Tabletop exercise is better. All right, we're running a little short on time here, JLP. So do this one quickly.
Jake, I got to tell you, that really surprises me. It's not like you told me we were running short on time here and to not talk quite so much over these slides. So we'll hurry along here. So when you do have an incident, one of the things we want to advocate for is that you support your resources. This is especially true for executive staff who might be working with technical teams. An executive, a CEO, the CFO, chief legal counsel, for example, they're going to be focused on how bad is this for the business, what's going on, and what's the potential impact that I need to be preparing for. They're looking at major things like, am I going to be able to pay people in the next week or so? Am I going to be able to keep doing business over the next week or so? Those are major thoughts that the CEOs and the leaders are having while they're trying to contend with processing all the information that the technologists are providing to them. Technologists are also heads down in firewall consoles, antivirus consoles. They're seeing their networks and the systems that they manage day in and day out being taken over by an attacker. That's a stressful time for anybody, especially if you put your heart and soul into work like a lot of IT people do. And so we've got organizations with resources who are getting burned out just because they're having to sit there and think about these heavy duty concepts and how do we handle this? How do we make sure we're doing the right thing for the company? How do we make sure we're doing the right thing for our clients? These are heavy mental loads. And so, especially if you've got technologists who are working for 8, 12, 16-hour shifts, they're working 5, 7, 10 days in a row, it's important to make sure that you're working them much harder than normal. You're going to be requiring long hours. You got to make sure that they're well stocked with things like food, caffeine, the ability to rest and take downtime, but they've also got to have the tools that they need. They may need to be able to go out and buy specialized tools and equipment, or they may need to be able to activate third party resources and know that they've got the budget and the funding to be able to do so. This is all critically important to making sure that the team itself is able to carry out the work that's being asked of them. But then once we've actually got the work over, once the incident's done and taken care of, and the attackers are booted out, and we know exactly which records have been affected, and all the notifications are happening, then we get into the retrospective process. And this is another very critical component of incident response. Once everything's done, we take a look back, not just over the incident and how was it managed, how did we do, what could we have done better, but we also look at the root cause. What caused the incident? How did we get there? What can we do to both prevent that specific incident and prevent the set of circumstances from occurring? Anybody who's worked in QA or in quality control, for example, might have heard of the 5 whys methodology. We're a big fan of this because it's a great way of getting down to the heart of a matter by asking why about 5 layers deep. You can do a quick Google search and learn about the methodology here. But doing a root cause analysis like that oftentimes will help identify what the circumstances were which allowed the incident to happen and how do we prevent that from occurring in the future.
And not just that, but also, how did we, what were our communications like, and how did we appear to the public, or anything like that as part of it as well. Um, you know, Usually I say, "Hey guys, what's the, what are the final thoughts?" Fred, this one is the final thoughts. Can you just walk people through this real quick?
Sure, it's what we just finished talking about. You need
Yep.
an IR plan, you need a policy, you need playbooks to understand what to do in specific threat instances. You need to test those things. Well, it's a tabletop exercise, probably at least once a year. Some people do them quarterly. Sometimes they're hybrids where you have a network component where you're actually running attacks, simulating attacks, where maybe the more process oriented people are dealing with it at a different level. Make sure your cyber insurance is well understood, that you have it, you understand it, you understand how it pays out, you understand how to get in touch with them and what kind of assistance they're going to provide. And make sure you've got somebody in your back pocket, because this stuff can be incredibly complex. Usually you need triple the amount of resources you have on staff to do these things because it's an emergency, massive action. So be prepared in the sense that you need to bring resources to bear, know where you're going to get those resources, and if you can, try to lock down those resources ahead of time.
Yep, that's great. Thank you, Fred. So just a reminder, this is what we do. We help organizations prepare for an attack, detect an attack, respond rapidly. I want some final thoughts here from Mike Hamilton. Right before we do it, we do have a survey, and I'd love for folks to take the survey. Believe it or not, our webinars have gotten better based on your feedback, and we really appreciate when folks take the survey. My colleague Jenny is going to put a Survey Monkey link in the chat. please take the survey. Also, if you want to contact us, you can contact us through that survey link. But we really want to know, was this helpful? Did we get you the right information? And on and on. All right, Mike, final thoughts.
Final thoughts. The population of threat actors coming after us has exploded. The bar has been lowered. You don't need skills anymore. You can, outsource it to people. There are mercenaries out there. People are being bribed internally. There are activists that'll come after you. So if there's anything you take away from this, it's get ready. Do the stuff you're supposed to do to make sure that you're ready to enact a plan and it's not foreign to everybody you hand it to.
All right, everybody. Well, we're at time. Thank you so much for joining us. My email and Ellie's email are full of folks who want the deck. We'll make sure we get it to you right quick here. Again, please take the survey. We really appreciate you being here and joining us.
Thanks for
And if
coming.
we don't see you before there's a webinar next week that we're going to do about predictions for 2023. You'll be able to sign up for that on our website. And have a great holiday season if we don't talk to you.
Thank you,
Bye-bye,
everyone.
everybody.
Thanks for coming.